Hello, good people. It's great to be back with you. I said that I was going to continue on this video the discussion of Hilaire Belloc's book, The Servile State, and the arguments that he makes in that book. And so the second part of the work on Hilaire Belloc. Now, Hilaire Belloc notes that, quote, slavery was of the very stuff of Europe for thousands upon thousands of years until Europe engaged upon that considerable moral experiment called the faith. And of course, by that, he's referring to the Catholic faith. He goes on to warn that as the Catholic faith is abandoned, that freedom would not be maintained. We can say that maintaining freedom apart from the Catholic faith has been the modern liberal project, and it's the project of the United States of America. And as far as we know, the project is in a great deal of danger. Will the modern liberal project of freedom apart from the Catholic faith and apart from Christianity succeed or fail? How does it seem it's working out? We can say for sure that there are a lot of factors in our modern American life that blind us to our lack of economic freedom. As Americans, we tend to think of freedom as a political thing rather than an economic thing. And we have all kinds of slogans, song lyrics, and things to help us to connect the idea of freedom with the idea of being an American. So we talk about the land of the free and the home of the brave, sweet land of liberty, from every mountainside let freedom ring, etc. Now, another thing that blinds us is luxury. We are trained to desire luxury, and for us sinners, that doesn't require a lot of training. We have almost completely forgotten that luxury was, through all the ages of Christianity, really considered a vice. An inordinate attachment to the lusts of the flesh and to sensual pleasures. And not really talking here just about sexual pleasures, but just a kind of indolence or luxuriating in things. And yet, the propaganda of advertising creates desire for things that didn't even exist just a short time ago. We have a lot of luxury goods that have a lot of status markers attached to them. They're often advertised by people who are very wealthy, who are celebrities, and we're urged to imitate them. Well, they don't care if we imitate them because they're the ones who are making money off of that imitation, off of their convincing us that we have to buy this stuff. Along with this, if we still stay in the arena of consumerism for a minute, is that we're given as consumers an illusion that we have a very wide variety of choices and things, brand names and brand competition to convince us that we're making a choice among a wealth of different options. This is especially true in three areas. It's especially true in the area of food, beverages, and media. Okay? Now, in reality, when you look behind food companies that look like there's a lot of different brands that are in competition, a lot of times you find that what you think are competing brands are actually all being created by the same company. This is true also in beverages. And in beer, if you look behind the companies that create the beers, we look like we have so many brands of beers, and in reality, almost all of them are created by one or two companies throughout the world. So we're given a certain illusion that we're living in an arena of choice and freedom when really we're constantly being directed to be sending our money to the same few people. If we start to complain about things like the wealth inequality that exists in our society, then we're reminded of things like the capitalists are the job creators, and so we should not criticize them or detract from them at all. We're also warned about this thing called class warfare. It's very interesting. because it only becomes class warfare when the lower classes start to make a ruckus. Consider a neighborhood that has been stable for generations, where the residents, though they are poor, have extensive mutual support and ties of friendship. A developer can go in and buy up properties and raise rents to get the poor out of there, and then gentrify the place so that a whole new population can take over and he can make a killing. He is not considered to be waging class warfare, but let the people start marching in protest against the destruction of their community, and suddenly then we get the warnings about class warfare. We're also given a lot of illusions of ownership and things to try to get us to buy into the whole system and the way it's set up. So here's one illusion of ownership. You'll be called a homeowner, even though the bank still owns most of your house. Capitalist management gurus like to throw around things of conversation or statements about ownership to the employees. So you can be told at work that you should take ownership of this or that task, and then you'll get a lot of praise if you do that. But if you try to demand some real ownership of that company and the means of production, you'll soon find out just how real that ownership is. Another way that we are given an illusion of ownership is through things like the ownership of stock. Like if we have mutual funds in a retirement portfolio or something like that, we are supposed to have the idea that we own parts of these huge companies. All right, and this is to get us to really be cheering on the capitalist project of these corporations. So that the more they increase their profits and thus their power over us, including the power that they're using to lobby the government, we're actually cheering for those who are subjecting us to more and more dishonesty in our political system, and they're restricting our political freedom, and we're cheering on the stocks are going up at the same time. Now, if you try to tell one of these companies that you object to some of their getting on board with every single progressive movement's new liberation idea for this or that odd group, then you're going to find out that you don't have any kind of voice. You're supposed to have ownership, but you really have no influence over them whatsoever. A lot of things conspire to keep us from noticing the erosion of citizen power and freedom in our country. It's a big country, and so they're usually careful not to come after too many of us at once. They'll go after a baker in one state yesterday, and then a rancher in another state today, and tomorrow they'll be after some sidewalk vendor in some other state. And it's such a piecemeal nature of attack that it makes it hard to see. And besides, we're constantly in a state of distraction, because our own attention has become another commodity that they can sell and trade with one another. So instead, if we turn our attention to the faith, to the Catholic faith, we will find out that the Catholic Church has a very great interest in human freedom. Now, if you're not Catholic, that might really surprise you. Even if you are Catholic, that might surprise you, because you may not have ever heard or read many of the teachings of the Church about human freedom. If we want to know how to correct what Hilaire Belloc feared was our slide toward servility, it will help us a great deal to understand how and what the Church built in Europe on the ruins of the Roman servile state. They built this during the Middle Ages and during the time and in the area of the most Catholic influence. Hilaire Belloc calls this action, quote, "the exceedingly gradual transformation of the servile state into something other, a society of owners." And he makes this point, quote, No dogma of the church pronounced slavery to be immoral or the sale and purchase of men to be a sin. In general, you will discover no pronouncement against slavery as an institution, nor any moral definition attacking it throughout all those early Christian centuries, during which it nonetheless effectively disappears, unquote. Now that's interesting. Without the church coming out explicitly and saying that slavery was wrong, nevertheless, there was some kind of formation of the mind and the conscience of the people of Europe that made slavery disappear. And that is what we need to take a look at. How did that happen? After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many areas of Europe fell into chaos as various groups attempted to fill the power vacuum. The period from the fall of Rome in the late 5th century to the year 1000 is known in history as the early Middle Ages and has sometimes been called the Dark Ages because of the decline in such markers of civilization as order, trade, the rule of law, and learning. We tend to think of Rome as being conquered by the barbarians, but the so-called conquering was largely done by means of wave after wave of immigration, tribal populations gradually replacing the Roman population. And a good number of them were already converted to Christianity, which, as you'll recall, had been legal for 200 years by this time. Those invasions destroyed cities, monasteries, libraries, schools, and institutions of law and government. During the next 200 to 300 years after the fall of Rome, the population of Europe declined by at least 1/5 and possibly as much as 1/2. In spite of the invasions, disruptions, and other catastrophes, such as epidemics, there were many bright spots amidst the darkness. It was, in fact, the church that stepped in to establish a modicum of order within the collapsing civilization, and even for the invading barbarians. As Christopher Dawson put it, quote, "The church had to undertake the task of introducing the law of the gospel and the ethics of the Sermon on the Mount among peoples who regarded homicide as the most honorable occupation and vengeance as synonymous with justice," unquote. Now, for the most part of this time, civic life was arranged around landed estates commonly owned by a lord. Now, the landed estates were called the latifundia, and the homes in which the lord himself lived were called villa. There were other human organizations around at the time: small peasant farms, groups of freemen in association, industrial factories worked by slaves for their masters, and some very reduced Roman towns. But of all of these, the villae were most common and destined to become the model of society. Each villa began as an extensive landholding with pastures, fields for crops, water, woods, and wasteland. The cultivated parts were worked by slaves to whom the lord owed nothing in return, although he had an interest in keeping them alive and breeding to perpetuate his wealth. Dotted amongst these villae were other landed estates worked by the freest men on earth, Catholic monks. The monasteries were centers of learning and technical development, especially in the field of agriculture. Areas enclosed in monastery walls provided islands of order, where careful records could be kept for the improvement of agriculture and domesticated animals, giving birth to the science of genetics. In England, monasteries owned 1/5 of all farmland. The monks would introduce new crops, new industries, and new production: the rearing and breeding of cattle and horses, the brewing of beer, the raising of bees and fruits. They established trade in agricultural products, from grains to cheese to wine to honey. They established salmon fisheries in Ireland and vineyards and orchards in many places. They taught people irrigation and constructed technologically sophisticated water-powered systems, including harnessing the power of rising and falling water with tidal mills. Water power was used for crushing wheat, sieving flour, making cloth, and tanning. Cistercian monks invented the blast furnace. Monks excelled in metallurgy, quarried marble, did glasswork, forged metal plates, and mined salt. They were skillful clockmakers. Not even the Roman world had adopted mechanization for industrial use to such an extent. The monasteries themselves were the most economically effective units that had ever existed in Europe, and they were managed by free men. The reign of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious in France from the late 8th century to the 9th century is believed by some historians to have kept European culture alive by the skin of its teeth. Their organization of education was particularly important in a time when even many priests could not read the Latin Vulgate Bible, and it led to a scientific and philosophical revival with the first universities established. Where else? Around the monasteries. Although education was not available to all at this time, noble families sent their children to monastery schools. Saint Benedict had instructed the sons of Roman nobles. Saint Boniface established schools in his German monasteries, with Saint Augustine and Saint Patrick doing the same in England and Ireland. Thomas Aquinas was born of a noble family and then educated by the monks in Monte Cassino before joining the Dominican order. As the second millennium dawned, there was finally an end to the major nomadic incursions, with conversions of the tribal areas. Norse Christian kingdoms were established in Scandinavia, and a Christian kingdom of Hungary recognized in Central Europe. In the 11th century, burgeoning populations began settling lands which had reverted to wilderness after the end of the Roman Empire. Prominent thinkers developed scholasticism and upsoared the great Gothic cathedrals. The church urged the landed nobility to deal justly with the population that served them, even as the church inculcated respect for the hierarchical order of society. So note this, you're dealing with all the levels, right? The church is inculcating respect for the hierarchy, but it's talking to the top of the hierarchy about justice and treating the bottom levels properly. To begin with, the production of wealth in the Roman villae was due to the application of slave labor to the land, and the slaves were as much the property of the Lord as was the land itself. The first modification, Belloc explains, quote, was a sort of customary rule which modified the old arbitrary position of the slave. The slave was still a slave, but it was both more convenient in the delay of communications and public power and more consonant with the social spirit of the time to make sure of that slave's produce by asking him for no more than certain customary dues. The slave and his descendants became more or less rooted to one spot. Some were still bought and sold, but in decreasing numbers. As the generations passed, a larger and larger proportion lived where and as their fathers had lived, and the produce which they raised was fixed more and more at a certain amount, which the Lord was content to receive and ask no more. The arrangement was made workable by leaving to the slave all the remaining produce of his own labor. The bargain implied was that if the slave community of the villa would produce for the benefit of its lord not less than a certain customary amount of goods, the lord could count on their always exercising that effort by leaving to them all the surplus which they could increase if they willed indefinitely. Now, let me put that in capitalistic terms. It would be like a corporation saying that it would take as its own a certain fixed amount, not a percentage, a certain fixed amount of profit, and all the remaining profit produced by its employees would belong in common to them for them to do with as they wished and increase to their own benefit. By the 9th century, these estates had come to be divided into 3 portions. One portion was domain, reserved privately to the lord. A second was occupied and almost possessed by the slaves. A third was common land with certain rights for the slaves and the lord. For example, on a pasture that could support 300 head of cattle, the lord might be allowed by custom to keep 50 while the remainder belonged to the slaves. But in English, we recognize that their status has really changed, so that we no longer designate them in English by the word slaves. We now call them serfs. Some of these serfs even worked on lands owned by the church, by the great monasteries where they enjoyed especially easy terms and a rich liturgical life. By the late Middle Ages, a nobleman might point to the square miles of his domain and say, "This is my land." But each peasant farmer on that land, for that is what they are by now, would point to his own fields and say, "This is my land." Usually the peasants could not sell their land, but they could pass it on to their heirs. Meanwhile, around the monasteries and villae, especially near major crossroads, villages and towns had grown up where various tradesmen, under the tutelage of the church and with instruction and spiritual care by monks, formed voluntary associations for mutual spiritual aid, mutual spiritual support, such as prayers and the offering of masses. These developed into brotherhoods for mutual material support, such as assistance to one another's widows and orphans or help in cases of natural disaster. These trade associations became the first guilds, merchant guilds, and would later become the hallmark of European trading and industrial life. They controlled the trade in towns and could fine traders who were not members of the guild for illicit trading. They had authority to punish for dishonesty or violating the guild's regulations. They supervised the quality of goods sold. The only goods not sold under the guild system were foodstuffs. For foods, the market was left completely unfettered. Guilds tamped down excessive competition or ambition and fostered cooperation. They celebrated the feasts of their patron saints and proudly sponsored processions and organized festivities on the feast days. They provided for sick or impoverished brethren, undertook the care of their orphan children, and celebrated masses for deceased members. They erected great halls, guild halls, or town halls for their meetings and public events. The Catholic Encyclopedia explains that, quote, "As time went on, the merchant guilds became more exclusive, and when the rise of manufacturers in the 12th century caused an increase in the number of craftsmen, it was natural that these should organize on their own account and form their own guilds," unquote. The system of craft guilds was administered by masters who had progressed through a long apprenticeship. Like the merchant guilds, the craft guilds cared for both spiritual and temporal needs by providing old age and sick pensions, pensions for widows, and burial funds. The master craftsman was an independent producer, needing little or no monetary capital and employing journeymen and apprentices who hoped in time to become master craftsmen themselves. The Catholic Encyclopedia says of this time that there, quote, "was no working class as such and no conflict between capital and labor," unquote. Besides the merchant and craft guilds, other religious and social guilds continued to exist through the Middle Ages. The church's sponsorship of various voluntary associations created a rich communal life with a strong network of support. Now, I'm going to show you a graphic that you can use to compare the way this system was organized by the church in the Middle Ages with the servile state that we looked at the last time. So just a moment, and let me get that on the screen for you. Okay, I hope that you can see this. I'm trying to make it bigger. There we go. Okay, whoops, go back up. There we go. Okay. Now, you might remember the graphic I had last time, and this is similar. The various components of it have a similar meaning. So this is towards the end of the Middle Ages, the way the economy was organized. Up at the top there in the purple rectangles, you would see those who would be at the top, who would be those who owned property and who also perhaps owned a few slaves. They would be at the very top of the hierarchy. Underneath, you see those who had probably once been attached to them as slaves and now were managers who were becoming part of a growing class of clerics, not in the sense necessarily of religious clerics, but more of a management type of people that were needed, whose services would be needed by the lords. They would be members of what we might call a growing small but growing bureaucracy type of workers. And then as you see here, this is the class. The green triangles mean the same thing that they did when we were talking about the Roman economy, except now that you can see that most of the economy, economic activity, is in these green triangles, which represent those who own their own means of production. So in essence, you could say they work for themselves. They are owners. And then at the bottom, you see those who are the small number of slaves still left, and also those who are of the proletariat. Those would be free men who do not own any means of production themselves and have to seek employment under someone else. But as you can see, they're now a very small part of the entire population. So this is what the basic economic structure of society looked at the end of the Middle Ages throughout almost all of the areas that had once been part of the Roman Empire's servile state. These triangles represent men who themselves labor, but who own their own means of production. And these would include family farmers, small business owners, and those who own parts of a larger enterprise at which they work in a cooperative, in some cooperative arrangement with others. Now, these people could legitimately be called capitalists because they own the means of production. But the point here is that they largely live off of the profits of their own labor, not merely the labor of other people. So we cannot say that the Catholic Church is against capitalists per se, because the Catholic Church tutored Europe in a system in which there was a wide ownership of capital property all throughout Europe. There's a difference between having capitalists and capitalism. In fact, what distributists would say, the problem with the current system is not that there are too many capitalists, but that there are not enough capitalists. Here you see the ownership of the means of production is distributed. there's widespread private ownership, and especially family ownership of productive capital, productive property. Remember, it is this, the ownership and control of the means of production, that determines what kind of economic system we live in. As Hilaire Belloc said, quote, to control the production of wealth is to control human life itself, unquote. Because the ownership class was so extensive in this distributed economy, employment was nearly unknown. There was always some work somewhere for everyone to do. There was also work even for people who today we would consider unemployable, such as those who are mentally impaired or disabled. The variety of tasks in an economy that is much more agrarian provides simple work opportunities that contribute to the common good, even for those who are incapable of work requiring education or skill. And of course, the man who owns his own productive property is never unemployed. But this same man is not driven by orders to keep producing once his own needs and the needs of his family are met. He can finish his work for a day or a week or for the year and then stop. He has no arbitrary number of hours to fill. He's free to decide his work is done for the day and go fishing or stroll down to the tavern for some ale and to catch up on the local news. Integral to this way of life was the home. Nearly everyone worked where he lived. A family might live above their shop or a weaver next door to his loom. Families worked together, and it was the duty of a father to teach at least one of his sons his trade. In other words, the home was a place of production, not merely a place of consumption. Because there was so little in the way of mass production, every place had its own character, its own architectural forms, its unique clothing fashions, its own stories and traditions. Food was varied by locale. Indigenous cheese cultures and local wild yeast guaranteed that you could not eat the same cheese sandwich from town to town. Even varieties of vegetables were highly diverse. There were hundreds of varieties of squashes and cabbages and beans, many cultivated in just a few square miles and unknown elsewhere. Since furnishings were handmade, every house was uniquely furnished. Now, I don't mean to make it sound idyllic, because it certainly was not, and it was still a fallen world of sinners. Without modern sanitation, or for that matter, even the level of sanitation Rome knew, diseases and epidemics were a recurring threat. A third of children died before the age of 5, and infant mortality may have been even higher. Mortality rates for women in connection with childbirth and the time shortly after birth was very high. Life was physically demanding in ways that our lives are not. But in spite of these hardships, Hilaire Belloc sums up the state of things like this, quote, with the close of the Middle Ages, the societies of Western Christendom and England, among the rest, were economically free. Property was an institution native to the state and enjoyed by the great mass of its citizens. Cooperative institutions, voluntary regulations of labor, restricted the completely independent use of property by its owners only in order to keep that institution intact and prevent the absorption of small property by great. I'm going to get off of this graphic now. Okay. This was, in fact, the very kind of society that Aristotle had recommended in his treatise on politics. Quote, great, then, is the good fortune of a state in which the citizens have a moderate and sufficient property. For where some possess too much and the others nothing, There may arise an extreme democracy or a pure oligarchy, or a tyranny may grow out of either extreme, but it is not so likely to arise out of the middle constitutions and those akin to them, unquote. So what this is saying, what Aristotle is saying here, is that it's in the extremes, like extremes of poverty or in extremes of wealth, that we see political extremism arise. But the middle section, just the families that have some property, they're not extremely wealthy, they're not driven into poverty, out of those, it's going to moderate the political system. It's only when that middle class is gradually shrunken or even demolished, so that there's extremes, that you then end up with political extremes. In his encyclical called On Jesus Christ Our Redeemer, Pope Leo XIII looked back at this accomplishment of the church, and this is what he said. When Jesus Christ had blotted out the handwriting of the decree that was against us, fastening it to the cross, at once God's wrath was appeased. The primeval fetters of slavery were struck off. God's favor was won back. Grace restored. The gates of heaven opened. Then man, as though awakening from deadly lethargy, beheld at length the light of the truth. He learned that the meaning of human life, the supreme law, the end of all things was this, that we come from God and must return to him. From this first principle, the consciousness of human dignity was revived. Men's hearts realized that the universal brotherhood. As a consequence, human rights and duties were either perfected or even newly created. Thus, men's aims, life, habits, and customs received a new direction. As the knowledge of the Redeemer spread far and wide, such a change came about that the face of the world was entirely altered by the creation of a Christian civilization, unquote. Now, this Christian civilization of widespread property, which Hilaire Belloc has illuminated for us, came to an end. Not entirely, not all at once, but it did come to an end with the development of a new regime of capitalism. And so in the next video, I'm going to discuss Hilaire Belloc's treatment of how it came about that this widespread ownership that had been by the end of the Middle Ages all throughout Europe and England came to an end. And then we're going to see how that might apply to what's going on in the United States now. Until we're together again, treat yourself as though you are someone you are responsible for helping, because you are responsible. So am I, and together we are making the world. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching.